boys and girls.
I don't get art.
There's nothing to get.
No, it always has to be explained to me, and then I have to have someone explain the explanation.
Art. When we hear that word, some of our minds jump to museums or framed paintings, and in that context, some people think, nah, I'm not a big fan of art, I just don't get it.
Black and white, red and green. The funkiest thing you've ever seen.
Name what his name is.
Party man, rock a party like nobody can. Rules and regulations, no place in this nation.
Art is for anyone who wants to experience it, and it's often in more places than we might realize. Songs you like, movies you watch, poems, theater, even a quilt that your grandmother made. All of that and more is art. So you might be wondering, well, then what is art? How do I define it? Well, that's tough. Art's been around for thousands of years, and through the ages it's evolved in a number of different ways. And the reasons for creating it vary from person to person depending on any number of factors. So defining art is pretty tricky, and it's something that's been debated throughout history. There just isn't one agreed upon definition. However, many believe that art is anything that stirs emotion in you. Now, the emotions that get stirred up depend entirely on your own history, your story, everything that comes together to make up who you are. And because of this, 3 different people can experience the same piece of art and have wildly different reactions to it. One person might think it's the most beautiful thing they've ever seen, the second person might hate it, and the third might not feel much of anything at all. And none of them would be wrong. Everyone's entitled to their own preferences and feelings when it comes to art.
Party holler if you wanna party.
I kind of like this one, Leave it.
The way you feel about your favorite song could be the same way that someone else feels about their favorite sculpture. And even though you might not like that sculpture, it can be valuable to consider why that person enjoys it so much. You may learn something about them and maybe even yourself. The term art is really just a label. Over the years, a lot of people have tried to classify what it is or what it isn't, but that's not really what art is about. It's about your personal experience with it and the meaning that you draw from it. Everyone reacts to art differently and has the potential to grow and learn from it. It gives us the opportunity to tell stories, record history, and tap into our emotions in a way that few other things can.
Oh dear. Oh dear.
Hey, how about this?
I don't even know how to react.
It's unbelievable. Oh,
Thank you.
look at
No, I
this.
appreciate
Look at
it.
this.
Thank you very
Oh,
much.
oh, oh,
They love me. They love it.
Ah!
Thank you very much.
Congratulations.
You don't have to buy any of them, you know.
Well, I wasn't going to buy any, but still, I can congratulate you.
Are you
Yes.
vying for the title of the most pretentious man in the world?
What is this?
Yes.
I've had this for decades. Ignite for me.
Congratulations. This is quite a
We're here for
display
support.
here.
Do you understand any of it?
No,
No, it's very
No.
confusing.
You don't
I
understand?
don't think you do either.
Let me show
with
you
all due
one
respect.
painting I just sold.
Yeah.
I'm very excited.
Then maybe you could explain the mystery of that
I
one.
will. This is one of my favorites. Yeah, so I sold this to a restaurant, and I'm really proud of it.
Who is that?
It's a self-portrait.
That's you?
What do you think a self-portrait means? Yeah, that's me.
That's like you from 50 years ago.
No, this is me now.
What? Do you honestly feel you look like that?
100%.
You know what? I think I want a portrait by Richard Lewis.
Yeah, well, look, he's going to make you look great. Maybe you could paint me with hair.
Every year, the city of Paris attracts 30 million tourists, of which 20 million visit the Louvre. On every street corner, you're surrounded by sculptures, gardens, and amazing feats of architecture. Now, imagine how many tourists would visit Paris if the city had no art. No paintings, no sculptures, no architecture. This is why we say art is priceless. We can't put a price on something that generates billions of dollars annually throughout the world. The amount created by art alone is uncountable. Artists may not make a lot of money compared to the average worker, but their contribution to a society is immeasurable. So, what is this thing called art? Traditionally, the definition of art is something considered to be created primarily for aesthetic purposes and judged for its beauty and meaningfulness, specifically painting, sculpture, drawing, watercolor, graphics, and architecture. But I would define it otherwise. I would say art is simply visual communication. In the Western world, and most of the known world, communication is widely verbal. That means that great importance is given to words. This is called logocentrism. Logos comes from the Greek, meaning word. Think about this for a second. How much importance does your society put in the word? People debate over the words. Years are absorbed by the truth or falseness of the word. Some people even fight and kill over the word. It's truly amazing to see how powerful words are in our society. But there are other forms of communication. One of these is visual communication. Visual communication, though secondary, is very important to our society, and it is a billion-dollar industry. And although most people put very little importance to visual communication, for some, visual communication and symbols are the only way they can convey a message. But for the vast majority, not much thought is given to how powerful and important visual communication is. Take a look at all the products we consume and purchase. Why do we try that can of Coke over the other brand? Why are some cars more appealing than others? When we want a bucket of chicken, how do we know we're going to the right restaurant? Through visual communication, we know where to go and what to expect. In fact, everything is art. From logo designs to font to the simple shape of your furniture. Just imagine watching your favorite sports match and not being able to differentiate the teams or the players on that team. How meaningful would that be? All of these designs and logos were created by artists and convey a message. One major aspect, and the basis of art, is making something aesthetically pleasing to the eye. The first thing artists learn early on is the importance of composition, how things are arranged in an aesthetic manner, what makes this can more appealing than that can, where to position your message on a two-dimensional plane. This is one of the key concepts of photography and filmmaking, which comes from art. How to communicate a pleasing landscape or a scene in a film. Subconsciously, everyone knows what a good movie shot looks like, but years of studying art and compositional theory are needed to create a wonderful scene in a movie. If you look at Stanley Kubrick's movie, A 2001 Space Odyssey, you can see he was well versed in art and art theory. Almost every scene is based in the basics of composition. This simple scene here is something we artists call the L composition, and it is one of the best ways to create interest and depth in art. In fact, if you watch a movie, art is everywhere, from the director's vision of the shot to the costumes and the face prosthetics. All of these things were created by artists. Even before the movie was created, a storyboard was drawn up by artists. Now, with the development of CGI, artists are refining the film industry and are no longer part of the starving artist cliché. Some are making millions of dollars creating characters in some of your favorite Lord of the Rings movies, or creating new worlds in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. All of these scenes were created by artists. Art is everywhere. It's just that people don't recognize it. Visual communication has always been part of our history. In fact, along hunting and gathering, it was one of the first forms of occupation. Early humans used art as a form of storytelling and communicating the world around them. In recent years, art has been used for revolution, and propaganda. Art can spark change, either for good or bad. In fact, these same tactics are used to sell you things. Artists are being hired by many corporations well educated in visual communication for marketing and visual psychology. Millions of dollars are spent annually to find the best way to visually communicate to the consumer why they need and want that particular product. Now, you may be saying to yourself, well, I understand visual communication, but what about visual art in galleries? To that I say, well, in the past, there was a need for storytelling. People 500 years ago were much like us. They wanted to be inspired. They wanted to be entertained. I don't know how many times I left the theater feeling inspired and motivated to do something grand. The ancients didn't have movies. They had paintings. They had sculptures. They read and understood art like we do books. They understood the symbols of each painting. They looked at Vermeer's painting and they understood that it wasn't just an autoportrait of the artist, but rather a bold statement on the political situation of the Netherlands at that time. They knew how to read all the symbols and they studied them for hours. When pious people of the Renaissance looked at Michelangelo's work in the Sistine Chapel, they read it as it should be read, like a comic book story. The entire work is communicating all the essential stories of the Bible in pictorial form. Most have forgotten how to read conceptual art like our ancestors did. But given some time and effort, it's not only entertaining, but can give you a better understanding of deep subjects and the world around you. This is why art and religious traditions always went hand in hand. After studying a painting of Rubens, people would discuss and debate what the work meant to them. And this would lead to long-winded discourses, much like what we do today after watching a movie. This is unfortunately why art seems bourgeoisie to some people. It seems far distant from what we consider as entertaining today. But it wasn't always so. Gallery art was treated like our comic books today. And if we approach it in such a way, it can appeal to all people and all intellects and all economic backgrounds, not just the ivory tower thinkers. I highly recommend watching a series with Sister Wendy, where she bridges the gap between explaining art in a way that's meaningful to our modern ears. People revolve their lives around art and visual communication. Take fashion, for example. Every culture and subculture uses visual communication to express who they are as people, from the punk to the businessman to the bum on the street. Each is visually communicating who they are and what their existence is about. And behind all of it is some whack job artist who created their clothing. Art is everywhere.
We don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race, and the human race is filled with passion. Medicine, law, business, engineering, these are noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, love, these are what we stay alive for. To quote from Whitman, "O me, O life of the questions of these recurring, of the endless trains of the faithless, of cities filled with the foolish. What good amid these, O me, O life? Answer that you are here, that life exists, and identity. That the powerful play goes on, and you may contribute a verse What will your verse be?
We live for art. We live for the next movie on the silver screen. We camp outside game shops waiting for the new video game to come the next day. We dress up in silly clothing to convey who we think we are. We are artists and consumers of art because we are humans and we have a need to communicate, whether it's verbally, musically, or visually.
There's a deep desire in us to make pictures. I mean, they've been drawing for 30,000 years. The teaching of drawing is teaching people to look. That's what it's doing.
It was really when I was at art school that I started to see the relationship between history, philosophy, politics, and art. Prior to that, I thought that art was just making pretty pictures. Actually, art is connected to, life.
You can't teach art in the same way you can teach French. French exists whether you do it or not. But when you're doing art, the center of doing art is in yourself. Most of the literate subjects do not ask that of them. So this develops an entirely different realm of skill.
Creativity is critical thinking. And without it, how are you going to really open up and ask harder questions? And art opens all of those kind of passages and possibilities to think beyond what we already know.
In a child's education, that doors need to be opened to other universes, other modes of thinking. And art is a non-predescribed, dangerous world full of possibility. And I think that's a vital space for children to have in the formative years of their education.
From a top-down level, you don't have innovation if you don't have arts. It's as simple as that.
It doesn't matter if you're going to study history or geography or science, you still need to be creative, because the people who are the outliers in those fields are the most creative people. To have art in schools be eroded, which is happening at the moment, is disastrous for Britain, I think, because our best industry is the creative industry.
Art and cultural production is at the very center of what makes a society what it is. And for an entire new generation not to know what is the cultural and visual history of ourselves is kind of...
Art is a reflection of the society that we are, the kind of mirror that art holds up, the way that art helps define the identity of a nation, that you can trace that back historically. It's deeply embedded in humanity.
What art education does to people who are not going to be artists is giving them the opportunity to build certain aspect of themselves that otherwise will be either ignored, undeveloped, or repressed.
It's all about kids finding out who they are, and they're all different.
That you can be whatever you want to be is something that art certainly taught me. It can access a part of your brain, body, spirit, mind that nothing else can.
Nothing is more stimulating, exciting, consoling than looking at a brilliant painting.
Art in schools shouldn't be sidelined. I think it should be right there, right up in the front, because I think art teaches you to deal with the world around you. It's the oxygen that actually makes all the other subjects breathe.
There's a great quote by John Ruskin. Art shows us what it is to be human. And really that's why art should be on the curriculum.
There's a big issue, probably in other places in the world, but we feel it a lot here in the States. The funding for arts education is always under stress. And the school boards are wondering, do we cut the art, do we keep the science? And there's tension. We know this. And I brought that up with David Byrne, and he had strong views on that as well. Let's check it out.
In order to really succeed in whatever math and the sciences and engineering like that, you have to be able to think outside of the box, and you have to be creative problem solving. And the way those disciplines are taught is not totally creative. The creative thinking...
Not at all.
Not at all. It's more like, this is this, this is this, this is this. The creative thinking is in the arts. A certain amount of arts education doesn't mean that your ambition is to grow up to be a painter, but you can use that kind of thinking and apply it to anything else, business, engineering, science.
And be better at it.
And you're better at that. You succeed more and you bring more to the world because you have these abilities that came from outside of your discipline. So bringing different worlds together has definite tangible benefits, and to kind of cut one or separate them is to injure them and cripple them.
You know, I basically agreed with everything he said in these interviews. I mean, he's a deep thinker, he's creative, he's educated, and so his thoughts they're put together in ways that really resonated with me. When I think of culture, what do I think of? I think you visit other countries and then they show you what it is that makes them them and not you. And in almost every case you do this, you are looking at their art. You are looking at their architecture. You are looking at aspects of their civilization that has been empowered by science and engineering. And so for anyone to say, let us cut art for anything else, suppose they did that back in Renaissance Europe. What would Europe be without the support and interest in a thriving culture of art? As we readily spend money to visit these cities and go to their museums, to turn around and say, now I'm going to cut the art budget here, that makes no sense to me. And it may be that science and art, which we know sort of go together, the arts and sciences are colleges of institutions, it may be that art and science thought of in that way are the only true things that we create that last beyond ourselves. Everything else comes and goes. The leaders, the politics, the economies. So am I biased? I don't know. But what I do know is if there is a country without art, that's not a country I want to live in. If there's a country without science, you're living in a cave. We measure the success of a civilization by how well they treat their creative people.
You might think there was a simple answer to this. After all, we know how to say what most things are for, like this or that. And people flock to museums like never before, so they must have their motives. But when it comes to art, people get strangely afraid to ask too directly what it might all be for. Because, well, everyone except you might know the answer already. It's perhaps too obvious, it's perhaps too complicated. The result is an awkward silence and a lot of confusion. But maybe it shouldn't be that hard to say what art is for. Maybe we can have a go at ascribing certain rather clear purposes to art. Here's 5 things that art might be able to do for us. It's an obvious but striking fact that the most popular works of art in the world show pretty things. Happy people, flowers in spring, blue skies. This is the top-selling postcard in the world from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Why prettiness matters. It's an emblem of hope, which is an achievement. Prettiness, those flowers and blue skies and kids in meadows, is hope bottled and preserved, waiting for us when we need it. The world often requires us to put on a cheerful facade, but beneath the surface there's a lot of sadness and regret that we can't express from fear of seeming weird or a loser. One thing art can do is reassure us of the normality of pain. It can be sad with and for us. Some of the world's greatest works of art have been loved for their capacity to make the pain that's inside all of us more publicly visible and available. Like putting on a sad piece of music, somber works of art don't have to depress us. Rather, art fights the false optimism of commercial society. It's there to remind us, with dignity, that every good life has extraordinary amounts of confusion, suffering, loneliness, and distress within it, and that therefore we should never aggravate sadness by feeling we must be freakish simply for experiencing it quite a lot. All of us are a little unbalanced in some way. We're too intellectual or too emotional, too masculine or too feminine, too calm or too excitable. The art we love is frequently something we're drawn to because it compensates us for what we lack. It counterbalances us. When we're moved by a work of art, it may be because it contains concentrated doses of qualities we need more of in our lives. Perhaps it's full of the serenity we admire, or perhaps it's suffused with a pain and drama we've had to stifle but want to get in touch with. Sometimes a whole society falls in love with a certain style in art because it's trying to rebalance itself, like France in the late 18th century that wanted David as a corrective to its decadence, or Britain in the 19th century that looked to the pre-Raphaelites to counter the effects of brutal industrialization. The art a country or a person calls beautiful gives you vital clues as to what's missing in them. It's in the power of art to help us be more rounded, more balanced, and more sane. The media is constantly giving us hints about what's glamorous and important. Art also tells us about what's glamorous and important, but fortunately, given that you weren't invited again to the Oscars this year, it usually picks on some very different things. Albrecht Dürer makes grass look glamorous. John Constable draws our attention to the skies. Van Gogh reminds us that oranges are worth paying attention to. Marcel Duchamp challenges us to look again at the seemingly mundane. These artists aren't falsely glamorizing things that are better ignored. They're justly teasing out a value that's been neglected by a world with a deeply distorted and unfair sense of what truly matters. Art returns glamour to its rightful place, highlighting what's genuinely worth appreciating. Nothing seems further from good art than propaganda, the sort encouraging you to fight or what government to support. But one way to think about art is that it is a sort of propaganda, in the sense of a tool that motivates and energizes you for a cause, only it's propaganda on behalf of some of the most important and nicest emotions and attitudes in the world, which it uses its skills to make newly appealing and accessible. For too long, art's attracted a little too much reverence and mystique for its deity. We should relax around it as we already do with music and learn to use it for what it's really meant for, as a constant source of support and encouragement for our better selves.
Some people do have very quick trajectories
to
where they get good at things, and so other people see that and say, I'm not talented. Some of the people I've seen that have become the best artists I know are ones who were slow beginners.
When you go on Instagram and you follow artists that are good, that's your feed. And that's what you compare yourself to. That is just a guaranteed way to see that you suck.
To get discouraged,
yeah. There's no way you cannot get discouraged when you look at it as something that you should have now.
Yeah.
You know, while I'm doing that, one of the most interesting things that we see as we run across the country teaching this fantastic method is people continually say, I can't draw a straight line. I don't have the talent, Bob, to do what you're doing. That's baloney. Talent is a pursued interest. In other words, anything that you're willing to practice, you can do. And this is no exception.
I started drawing when I was a very, very young child. I presented my mother with a pile of typewriter paper that had been folded over, covered with drawings, saying, this is what I'm doing for the rest of my life, when I was 6 years old. Drawing has always been part of who I am. And New York has always been an inspiration, even though I was a country kid. And I always knew this would be my home. And I couldn't wait to draw it for real. When I first moved here, I couldn't afford to go to the movies. I couldn't afford a lot of things. So I would go up to the top of the Empire State Building, and they had no screens up. So I could actually sit on the edge of the Empire State Building and draw. Then I would go out to South Street Seaport, and I would draw again. And it all represented a breathing, living city. The city is a very vertical place. And as a cartoonist, you tend more to play with vertical shapes. The water tanks and everything are resting on very high spaces. And people live on top of each other in womb-like environments. So the city lends itself to long brush strokes, whereas the country or mythical lands tend to be much more horizontal. That's why when I did 300, for instance, I went for a horizontal format. And I knew that spectacle is something that you experience as a human being this way. Whereas the city is something you tend to experience this way. I've devoted a lot of my career to capturing it because it is alive. Every inch of it's alive. Let's get back to Max Gaines. He created the half tab, as it's called, the half tabloid, half the size of the New York Post. He folded a newspaper in half twice and said, I think we got something. And that became the format of the comic book. Now, it adapted over the years through strange printing changes to the bizarre form it is now. It's actually 3 inches shorter than it should be. And nobody knows why, except that the racks were built that size. That's how dumb the world of comics is. So much could be done. It would just knock all those goddamn racks and boxes down and do whatever we wanted to. The 50s had taken their toll on comic books. Everybody took too seriously the rash of censorship. And also, comics were beaten down economically. They weren't selling. Comics were, the time I entered the field, considered strictly child's play. Creatively, they turned around at Marvel Comics first. You wake up one morning, and your mom wonders why you're a little moody. And it turns out there's these things going through your veins that are called hormones. And they make your fantasies a little more violent, and they make you look at girls a little differently. And so your fantasies change. Jack Kirby owned that era. He owns that moment in any man's life. And what Stan and Jack did on the Fantastic Four and the Avengers and all, Captain America, all those other titles, is really astonishing comic books, and it's some of the best I've ever done. Jack Kirby just explodes with adolescent power. They were an explosion of imagination. They were everything I wanted out of drawing. It wasn't until Will Eisner that I went into a much more nuanced, human look toward things. Several things kept us alive through this period. One was the underground comics, mostly known for the work of Robert Crumb and Richard Corbin. And then the guys in the mainstream, what we call the mainstream, the guys who did the X-Men and Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., like Neil Adams and Jim Steranko. It was only when my generation came into play that we started waking everybody up again. Well, Neil Adams, coming from advertising, brought a photographic reality to comics. And so his anatomy was just utterly beautiful to behold. The first time I ever saw Neil Adams draw the Angel, the X-Men character, and actually saw wings drawn like wings, it was breathtaking. And Neil Adams brought a photorealism to comics that they'd never seen before, and instantly outdated everything before him. Jim Steranko brought a pop culture sensibility. He brought references that from the pulps and from just uncanny sources. Everything that was going on in pop culture, Jim Steranko brought to the fore. The outburst of the independent publishers, like Dean Mullaney and Dennis Kitchen, a whole new kinds of comics becoming available. But the rest of us had to keep going in different ways. I mean, I came to New York just really hoping I could make my living doing comic books. I just wanted to tell cool stories about Spider-Man and Daredevil and stuff like that. I didn't have aspirations. I just wanted to do this for a living because drawing was in my blood. I was doing Daredevil when I went to my editor and said that my character who I'd created, Elektra, had to die. And my editor, Denny O'Neil, said, they'll never go for it. She's more popular than the title character. And I said, well, Jim Shooter's right down the hall. Let me talk to him. And I went into Jim Shooter's office, and all 7 feet of Jim Shooter was sitting there, looking very severe. And I said, Jim, I gotta kill Elektra. And he lowered his head, and then he looked back up and he said, tell me a story, Frank. And I told him exactly what I planned to do, and he said, it's great, do it. I had a powerful ally at the top of the company. The old fart came back with a contract with God. What he did was he said, this is where we can go, as something that is not temporary, as something that stays on the shelf, stays alive for generations to come. Once I really absorbed it and I gained enough power in the industry, I started working on my series Ronin as an answer to Contract with God. And I took in influences from France and Japan and everywhere else to create a reckless piece of work that I'm still very proud of, because you can watch the handcuffs come off me. The notion of authorship really was born with a contract with God. And for me, it was with Ronin. And then I looked to apply it to the old standard heroes with Batman when I did The Dark Knight Returns. Because I wanted to create things that would last. They were still stuck on the yellow circle on his chest and so on. And then came up with an excuse dramatically for him to lose his costume, so that he showed up with just a big old bat on his chest, which he's worn ever since. So yeah, part of what I did was trickery, part of it was having allies in very high places. It's the time I totally internalized the idea that you can throw the pamphlet over your shoulder and say goodbye. And that if your story is 200 pages long, that's great. If it's 148 pages long, that's great. If it's 500 pages long, who cares? It's your story. It was really, for me, the introduction of the sensibility of a novelist rather than a pamphleteer. When Dark Knight came out, when Watchmen came out, people went, wow, this is really scary. This isn't like the world of Superman anymore. Now you walk into a comic shop and you see 70 years of history, whereas before you saw 3 weeks of history. Things have changed now because Eisner stuck his sword in the sand and the rest of us followed up. I liked black and white crime movies when I was growing up, and I love black and white crime movies now. First off, in black and white, they were able to cut to the heart of the story. Second, how they used film to tell stories in a way that didn't flood you with color, that in fact didn't use it at all, or with detail. Whether a 30-foot room could include only a desk and a lamp and a guy, and you believe it. The thing that people miss is that they went to the heart of darkness, just like Dashiell Hammett did, just like Raymond Chandler did. They crawled inside your skull and showed us all how evil we could be. And then our rare moments of heroism become more celebrated. That's all Sin City's about. It's Jim Thompson's world. It's not Steven Spielberg's world. It's a world where we are driven by ugly impulses and we do good things rarely. And we are defined by them. I remember when I started Sin City, I realized I had to finally figure out how to draw cars. And so I bought tons of little cars from like the Franklin Mint and so on. Learning from Jeff Darrow, the artist of Hardboiled, I realized that the best kind of props were three-dimensional. He taught me that if you want to draw a gun, get one. There's lots of fake guns that don't actually fire bullets. One of the things that I feel that's amazing about working in cinema is that there are so few limitations that it becomes dangerous. Working in digital process, for instance, you can do anything, so you have to watch yourself and not do too much. Whereas in comic books, you're limited by the page because the page becomes a statement of itself. Its juxtaposition of pictures and so on is finite. And where a cartoonist's worst enemy is time, because any comic book can be read very quickly. If you know how to slow the reader down, you've mastered the art of comics. Whereas in film, you have absolute command over time. I mean, the viewer has to sit there and watch unless they're gonna leave the theater. My way is to lay out everything in advance and then to come in and play with it. What Will Eisner taught me was that you could show what decade you were in, what room you were in, and who you're surrounded by, with the corner of a table, with a banister or a lamp. I would do it now if I wanted to say somebody was in, say, Los Angeles. I'd do it with a pile of blackberries. It's the same thinking. It's giving you just enough evidence. That is where the job gets harder and more rewarding. I believe that work explodes. A lot of the best stuff that I do is when I'm snapping a brush full of white paint over my wrist and something just splatters all over somebody's face. And matter of fact, I really don't believe in mistakes anymore. I believe that there's nothing but instance. I want to see things go completely wild, and I want to be part of it. I think chaos is a beautiful thing. Allowing entropy to take its course and then to guide it and to control it as an artist. It's what a potter does. It's what a bricklayer does. It's what a painter does. It's what we all really do. I think the graphic novel is a very pretentious term to describe something that has no good name. I've always been part of pop culture. That's what I enjoy. That's what I enjoy producing. I see nothing demeaning in it. I don't think that a smaller audience is a sign of virtue. Comics are a young form, so is film, so is the novel. If you flip back the pages of history, all these forms are young. Guys like David Lapham and James Sachalka and some of the other guys who are coming up right now, it's just starting to explode. Look at how hungry Hollywood is for comic book ideas right now. And most obviously in Iron Man and Batman and so on, but also in things like Harvey P. Carr's work. It's all changing. We are now standing shoulder to shoulder as sister art forms with film and with literature. I mean, I don't think that there's a big future for, say, the oral heroic poem a la Homer. I think the Nickelodeon's pretty much finished. But comics are just getting started.
Answer that you are here, that life exists and identity. That the powerful play goes on and you may contribute a verse. That the powerful play goes on and you may contribute a verse. What will your verse be?